Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the Embodied Carbon Network's 2019 webinar series. My name is Victoria Herrero Garcia. I am a whole building LCA analyst for a company based in Denver, Colorado called Ambient Energy, and I am very excited to be volunteering for the Embodied Carbon Network as the webinar coordinator, and I will moderate today's session. This is the number 2 session of a 6-part annual webinar series. We have several exciting speakers joining us today who will discuss updates on different policies related to embodied carbon. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made publicly available upon its completion on the Embodied Carbon Network website. Today we have with us Eric McDade. She is the program director with Architecture 2030 and the co-chair of the Embodied Carbon Network. Hello, Erin.
Hi, Victoria.
Hi. Go ahead, introduce us to the Embodied Carbon Network.
Great. So many of you joining today are already members of the Embodied Carbon Network, although we do have some guests in the audience who we invite to learn more and to join the network when this webinar is completed. The Embodied Carbon Network is a communications and knowledge sharing platform that was launched by the Carbon Leadership Forum in January of 2017. The network brings together professionals working in or with the building sector to share news and resources, engage in discussion, and develop educational content. The network has evolved into a vibrant global community. To date, we have over 500 professionals. Yay, we crossed the 500 threshold, which is really exciting, from across the building sector, academia, nonprofit, and government groups. And our members represent 121 cities across the world from 17 different countries. And there are 102 members that are part of the policy focus group who put together this webinar. We are brought together under a shared mission to eliminate embodied carbon emissions from the built environment in order to meet global greenhouse gas emissions targets by 2050. And the Embodied Carbon Network comprises of 10 subject-specific focus groups, which members can join for additional engagement around a topic related to embodied carbon. And you can see all of the groups listed here and learn more information about each of the groups on the Embodied Carbon Network's website. The Embodied Carbon Network is funded and managed by the Carbon Leadership Forum. And the Carbon Leadership Forum is an industry academic collaborative based out of the University of Washington that carries out research, education, and outreach initiatives focused on embodied carbon emissions tracking and reduction. And we want to give a big thank you to our sponsors for supporting the Embodied Carbon Network and this annual webinar series. So Victoria, back to you.
Yes, sorry, I was muted. Again, so today's webinar is the second session of a 6-part series. Each topic is based off network focus group topics. Network focus group chairs have worked with their groups to identify speakers and develop the curriculum for each session. Our goal is that each session will not only be useful to live participants, but also serve as a free educational resources for anyone interested in learning more. Please feel free to share webinar recordings with your colleagues, professional networks, and students. Mention of trades, names, or commercial products that not constitute endorsement or recommendation for use. Please note the options, ideas, products, or data presented by speakers in this session do not represent members of the Embodied Carbon Network or constitute endorsement by the network. Our goal is to introduce topics that could help participants think and talk about building industry strategies for reducing carbon emissions attributed to building materials. So a few things to note before we kick off the presentations. The presentation will end at 10 a.m. Pacific time. Then it will be a Q&A session of 15 minutes. Please submit your questions through the Zoom chat function, and I will track and direct them to the appropriate speaker at the end of the session. If you are an AIA member and in need for educational credits, this course is eligible for live attendance to receive credit. Please email to info@embodiedcarbonnetwork.org with your AIA number and full name. If you missed previous webinar sessions, please visit the embodiedcarbonnetwork.org/webinar to access session recordings. And stay tuned for more information on upcoming webinars. Save the date, the session 3 is coming up on June 21st at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and the webinar has been organized by David Arkin, the Renewable Materials Focus Group Chair. So for today's session, we have speakers all across North America talking about embodied carbon policies. We have Truda Rauken, Deputy Director of the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, talking about city embodied carbon policy. Patrick Enright, green building engineer from the City of Vancouver, talking about City of Vancouver LCA and embodied carbon policy. Then we will pass it on to Catherine Phillips, director of the Sierra Club, who will give us some updates on the Buy Clean California. And it will be followed by Jordan Palmieri, senior policy analyst from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, to talk about exciting City of Portland new policies. And final, last but not least, Ryan Ciso, founder and chief operating officer at Mantle, and he's also the co-chair of the policy group, and he will give us some updates with green building rating systems. So with that said, we will pass we will have our first speaker, Truda Rauken. Truda is the Deputy Director for the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, CNCA, where she leads the implementation of key alliance strategies and programs. Prior to joining CNCA, Truda served as a senior policy advisor on climate and energy to the City of Oslo, where her main responsibilities were tied to implementing the city's ambitious climate action plan and to leading the city's international climate engagement. Prior to that, Truda worked as a senior researcher at the world-leading Climate Research Institute, CICERO, Center for Climate Research. She brings expert knowledge on the local level government's role and capacity in solving challenges coming from climate change and the importance of network collaboration. Truda says that the world is local whenever she gets the chance. She holds a master's in political economy from BI Norwegian School of Management and a bachelor's in journalism and communication from the University of Oregon. Truda?
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you for this opportunity to speak a little bit about what the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance is doing to help our cities addressing embodied carbon in building materials or in the built environment. So I'm going to quickly run us through, if I can get this to work. That's too quick. There we go. I'm sorry about that. So I'm going to my main focus of my presentation is to talk about a meeting or workshop that we had in New York at the end of April. But I'm going to give you a little bit of the background leading up to that meeting, and then the outcomes of the meeting and what our cities are focusing on next. So first, a little bit about, for those of you who are not familiar with the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, I'm just going to say briefly that we are a global alliance of 22 cities that are collaborating to achieve 80 to 100% emission reductions by 2050 or sooner. The CNCA mission is to then enable these cities and support their work, because they are transforming what we think of as a city today, and they're doing that in record time. And we learn from our cities that the support that they get from each other and the support that CNCA is offering them is crucial in this work. And we believe that, so from our theory of change, that if these cities cannot reach carbon neutrality, then no cities can. But we do take the learnings from our cities and distribute them as widely as we can to what we call next wave cities, both for them to scale up or scale down the solutions that our member cities have already implemented. So moving on to the work that we do on embodied carbon is, usually our cities work on scope 2 emissions, and embodied carbon is not a part of those emissions, but it is it has come up as a topic that our cities are interested in tackling over the last year. And especially this rose on the agenda when we had our annual meeting in September 2018 in Boulder. This was one of the topics that came up, that the cities would like CNCA to support them on. And then with the generous support of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, we have launched a working group addressing this for cities interested in developing policies to reduce embodied emissions in the built environment. We launched that in 2019, and we basically asked our cities, what do you need to be able to move forward on the policy development? And they were fairly clear. They wanted, first of all, learning from some of the cities that have started to address this through policies already. And also another big question that came up is tools for calculations and materials. Like what can you actually include in a policy when it comes to materials, and what kind of data do we have access to actually set a target to reduce embodied carbon? So what we did then was that we had hosted 2 webinars for the working group cities, where we first had 2 of the leading cities in this space, and that is the city of Oslo and the city of Zurich, presenting their respective policies on embodied carbon and their planned next steps for developing them further. And then in April, we asked Skanska and Bionova and Architecture 2030 to present tools and from Skanska and Bionova, and then Architecture 2030 presented their materials palette. And this all led up to the embodied carbon meeting that we hosted at Pecanico in April this year in New York. And at that meeting, we gathered the cities first and foremost, but they don't operate in isolation in this space, as you all know. So we also invited, if we want to group them as non-city stakeholders, to the meeting as well. So we had the cities that we have in this group is Boulder, Oslo, Portland, San Francisco, Seattle, Toronto, Vancouver, and Zurich. And then we had, as you can see, the Embodied Carbon Network was there. Kate Simonen, thank you for attending and participating. And we had industry representatives, but it also brought on the funding community so that they can see how their support is helping our cities move forward in this space. And what the workshop was all about, helping the cities in their work to develop policies to reduce embodied emissions. And their voiced needs were on getting new ideas to address embodied carbon earlier in the process. Again, technical assistance, how do you do tools and calculations? How can you sort of get into the details of that? Materials certification, it's not so for cities that they can just reuse materials. There are often strict regulations connected to the reuse of materials, and a lot of materials cannot be used because of for safety reasons. Also, how do you promote reuse and circularity in the building industry? The stakeholder engagement, how do you reach out to those, and who are the stakeholders that you need to reach out to, and when? Also, it's not necessarily the sustainability office that will actually move forward on the policy once it has been adopted. So how do you address those tensions between the sustainability office or environment department and the other relevant departments in this work in a city organization? And also they wanted help with communicating what is achievable, considering this is a fairly new space for cities to be in. And, sorry. There we go. Then early on in the discussions, we identified some clear emerging issues, those pertaining to policy. These cities are working under fairly strict deadlines, and one of the issues that came up, how can you have a policy that has success by 2025? That's 5.5 years from now. How do you develop a policy framework, and what does a roadmap look like to get to that framework? And then also, how do you use zoning in the policy development? Then to do that, you need to sort of have the community on board, and the political will, or the policies that you suggest have to be, of course, politically feasible. So in that, which part of the community do you need to have involved in this work? Because not everybody does need to be involved, but who identify those key partners is an issue that came up. And of course, whenever you talk about political feasibility, it's also the question of cost effectiveness, and how do you address that when you want to use materials with reduced embodied emissions. Again, inventory and accounting. How can you make sure that you have reliable data? How do you do the calculations? And once you actually have the policy in place, how do you have good systems for monitoring, reporting, and verifications of emissions? And last but not least, industry alignment, and then an important issue that comes up, how do you enter into successful public-private partnerships that will actually help you reduce the embodied emissions in the built environment? And then so these were basically discussions happening on that day one. And the morning of day two, Vince Martinez from Architect to 2030, who was there, had sketched out a policy map that that listed all, as you can see here, all the policy options that we had been discussing on the previous day. What kind of outcomes you can expect from different types of policies, and in the end, how can they all move towards a whole building's performance standard? And I'm not going to go through this figure right now, and instead encourage you to look at it, and you feel free to send any questions my way that you have on them. We also had breakout discussions, because this is always crucial in the workshops that we do, so that the cities can actually discuss the issues that they are facing. So we had one session where we tried to look far ahead. So in the next 2 to 3 years, what can you accomplish? And what do we actually want to see be the end result in 10 years from now? And then we sort of tightened the time horizon and said, okay, but to get to the next 2 or 3 years, or to get to that end target in 10 years, what can you do what are your next steps for the next half year up to next 2 years to go citywide? Again, that means a lot of stakeholder mapping. Who do you need to involve in this work? And again, listing what you actually need to get it done. We also had one group that we just called Vision 2050 that were discussing what it would actually take to get to zero. And in that group, there were more conversations around adaptive challenges. So is there a way that we can use the built environment that we have today in a different way than what we are using it today to as much as possible avoiding building constructing new buildings? And there we go. I'm not a thank you yet. Let's see. Right. So what are the next steps for the cities when it comes to their policy development? Well, some of them who are just starting the work will start with sort of picking the low-hanging fruits in this, and they will do that right away. They also need to learn from the current collaboration that they have in this group, and now that they have some suggestions for how to connect better with the industry in their own region, that is what they will move forward on. Also, looking at whole building targets is something that a lot of them express the need to do, and continue sort of the bilateral discussions on targets, city to city discussions is something is a very common outcome of our workshop, because they have now these good working relationships and can easily reach out to other cities who are in the same situation. And of course, working through reference documents is crucial, because they are a big part of the foundation for the policy development. But not only do they need to connect with the cities in this working group, but also connect more with cities in their region to see if they can build this momentum in a region, and through that get more traction with industry. And last but not least, as our cities do in a lot of the spaces that they work, use the commitments that other cities have to push for more ambitious targets in their own cities. So I think that is it from me, and thank you.
Thank you, Truda. And now we are going to pass the controls to Patrick Enright. Patrick Enright is the green engineer with the City of Vancouver Sustainability Group, where he works on green building policy for large new buildings. Current priorities include the implementation of the Zero Emissions Building Plan, with the first step being the recent update of the green building policy for rezoning. Patrick is a professional engineer with years of experience in the building industry, including a number of years in Vancouver with a mechanical engineering firm in design and energy modeling. Prior to moving to Vancouver, Patrick worked in the National Project Management Office of the Defense Construction Canada, located in Ottawa. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Good morning, everyone on the West Coast, and afternoon to everyone on the East Coast and beyond. I'm grateful to be presenting to you today from the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people here in Vancouver and in the surrounding region, and very grateful to be able to do that today. So very excited to talk to everyone about where we are with embodied carbon here in Vancouver. So I have control here, and I can advance slides. There we go. Okay, so I think, can everyone hear me okay? I'll take that as a yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
yep, we can hear you.
Thank you. Just want to make sure. So I don't think I need to talk to this group too much about why materials matter. We know stats like a new New York City will be built every month for the next actually 40 years. When you put it all together, construction, 11% of global emissions, the timing of emissions matter. Embodied emissions happen, most of the embodied emissions over the life cycle of a building happen before the time of occupancy, so they're happening today. And I also want to talk a little bit, I'll take this opportunity to talk a little bit about what we've done so far here in Vancouver and what brought us to today, but most of my presentation focuses on where we go from here, what our next steps are. But this last point, with zero emissions buildings, materials are everything. So in Vancouver, we have a zero emissions building plan with the goal of all new construction being zero emissions operationally by 2030 or sooner. And actually, the bulk of this presentation focuses on our climate emergency response that was recently approved unanimously by our council, and we've kind of shifted things forward even closer to 2025 in terms of targeting zero emissions buildings operationally in new construction. So, of course, if you think of that pie that is operational and embodied emissions over the life cycle of a building, as operational goes to near zero, then embodied emissions become the whole pie. They become everything. They are the emissions that are associated with construction. So how do we tackle that? So recognizing that, and in Vancouver, we first implemented portions of our zero emissions building plan in 2016, coming into effect in 2017 with our green buildings policy for rezonings. It's a policy we have that affects developments seeking extra density going through our rezoning process. We ask for a higher environmental standard. And with that, recognizing that we were reducing operational emissions, we started requiring whole building life cycle assessment with all new rezonings. So at a preliminary stage, when you're doing a rezoning, but also, you'll have to do it again when it comes time for your building permit and update it again one last time after you before occupancy. So once you have a bill of materials, we've been requiring whole building LCA with those, and that means that since 2017, we've collected over 70 rezoning submissions with design stage whole building life cycle assessments.
Patrick, sorry for interrupting you. Are you moving through the slides because it's
No, not yet. Sorry.
Oh, okay, sorry. Just wanted to make sure. Okay.
No, I just wanted to provide a little more background on what we've done to date before I jump into. Most of my slides focus on what we're doing next. So, yeah, I apologize. I don't have slides on this matter. I just wanted to share a little bit more of it. So we've been requiring whole building LCAs. We commissioned a report to go back and look at all of those life cycle assessments, make recommendations for how the process might be improved, and give us a roadmap going forward. That's all available on our website, and I'll share the address for that at the end. But some interesting, some teasers from that report are, you can see the differences between, for example, wood frame, low-rise buildings that are wood frame versus concrete, and you can also see some variations, even by consultant, and some analysis in there on some of the variations that take place when conducting whole building life cycle assessments. But generally, the results were in a pretty tight grouping. Everyone used the same software. Everyone had the same assumptions. That we more or less had the same criteria for whole building LCA as the LEED V4 credit. So all to say, I think that's been pretty successful, and there's more about that on our website. So that brings us to today. Where are we today? And I just advanced this. Here we go. So in January, our city council declared a climate emergency unanimously and gave us 90 days to report back with a policy response to the climate emergency. Through the incredible work of my colleagues, they came back with a response to council in April with 53 accelerated actions and 6 big moves. I'll talk about those in a second, but that response was unanimously approved by council in last month. The 6 big moves they had an objective of putting us in line with our 1.5 degree scenarios of the IPCC. They're intended to be technically achievable, but really pushing the limits. When staff recommended moves that they felt comfortable were achievable, senior management pushed back and said you have to go further. And so we did, but still within the bounds of what's technically feasible. And we also recognize that there will be partnerships and tools and many kind of supporting measures that will be required, like a climate and equity working group that we're setting up to support all of that and make sure it's working well for everybody. So without further ado, in that response, I won't talk about our 53 accelerated actions, but these 6 big moves are what we will be working on over the next year and coming back to council with plans on each of them. Number 1 is by 2030, 90% of all people will live within an easy walk and roll of their daily needs. Number 2, by 2030, 2/3 of trips in Vancouver will be by active transportation and transit. Number 3, by 2030, 50% of kilometers driven on Vancouver's roads will be by zero emissions vehicles. Number 4, by 2025, all new and replacement heating and hot water systems will be zero emissions. Number 5, I'll talk about it in a second. And number 6, by fall 2020, we'll develop a negative emissions targets that can be achieved by restoring forests and coastal ecosystems. I won't go into those in any more detail, but our big move 5, lower carbon construction. So by 2030, we have a goal of 40% reduction in embodied emissions of construction and buildings compared to 2018. So that's buildings and infrastructure, that's public and private. That's our goal. We don't have all the details of the plan to get there, but that's what we're going to be coming back to council with over the next few years, or the next year, I should say. So 40%, is that possible? Well, we gathered a few data points in order to show that we believe this is technically possible, and we also had conversations with a number of experts. Some of you are on this call today. So we looked back at our rezoning submissions and saw that at least in low-rise construction here in Vancouver, you can build up to 6 stories out of light frame wood construction. The light frame wood constructions showed on average about a 40% reduction compared to their concrete low-rise construction. There's a study by the U.S. Concrete Ready Mix Association showing that, and this one may have just focused on the concrete itself rather than the whole building, but showing that a 36% reduction was possible just with supplementary cementitious material like fly ash and slag. We commissioned an additional study, kind of a quick study on looking at high-rise construction here in Vancouver, high-rise residential. That's also on our website and available to see. Looked at a number of iterations, including supplementary cementitious material, going to something like precast hollow core slabs. Sorry, that's I'm jumping ahead here. That's the last bullet point. And looking at some other changes, even including, if we can cut parking by 50%, would that help reduce embodied emissions? And it does. So that study is available on our website, and that showed a 22 actually to 47% reduction, still building a concrete high-rise tower, residential tower. And finally, the third bullet here, we looked around at some of the high-rise studies that have been done on mass timber, like Brock Commons here in Vancouver and the Seattle Mass Timber Tower study. And those showed 25 to 45% reductions in embodied carbon using mass timber construction for high-rise residential. I think that difference has to do with how your lateral system, lateral structural system, whether that's timber or whether it's a concrete core, and of course many other factors. Many assumptions go into these analyses, but this gives us a sense. These are some data points that give us a sense that 40% is possible today. We don't know what that costs, but that's what we need to find out. And so I won't go through this. There are other benefits, of course, co-benefits to reducing embodied emissions. And what do we do next? So as I mentioned, we know it's possible, but we don't know what it costs. And so we need to set a target in our next rezoning policy that will come into effect 2021. We don't know what that target should be, whether it should be, say, a 5%, a 10%, 15% reduction. We don't know what maybe prescriptive requirements should also sit alongside that whole building requirement, whether to protect sustainable sourcing or to protect against some of the kind of more problematic material choices that you could be driven to, or even just kind of, yes, you can meet your whole building target with some very carbon intensive materials, but why do that if they're not necessary? So maybe we can protect against some of those things. So all to say, our next step is to do a study with industry on what does that cost curve look like to reducing embodied carbon. That'll allow us to go to our stakeholders and consult on the next step and say, you know, this is what it costs, this is what it doesn't cost, these are the barriers, this is what we're thinking for a first target. And of course, we're also working to follow our provincial lead here and enable mass timber construction at a higher, up to 12 stories, and possibly some other measures as well that can kind of support or unlock the ability to build out of mass timber. And with that, this website I mentioned, vancouver.ca/zero emissions, we have an embodied emissions, reducing embodied emissions section on there. You can see both of the reports that I mentioned. And also you can always reach me at patrick.enright@vancouver.ca and our generic box, green.buildings@vancouver.ca. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. Now we're gonna have Catherine Phillips. She is the director of the Sierra Club, California, the state legislative and regulatory arm of the Sierra Club, the largest and oldest grassroots environmental organization in the country. Since 2011, she has managed Sierra Club's advocacy at the California State Capitol and at key state agencies. She previously worked on environmental policy in California for Environmental Defense Fund and the Center for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Technologies. She has been based in Sacramento since 2001. Before becoming an environmental policy advocate, Catherine worked as a journalist for nearly 20 years. She has written for newspapers and magazines and is the author of 2 books about environmental issues, Tracking the Vanishing Frogs and Paradise by Design. Catherine? Catherine, I think you're muted. Let me try to find you and unmute yourself. Sorry. Let me do it for you, Catherine. I can unmute yourself. I will take control of the remote, the mouse for a second. Catherine, can you hear me? If you can hear me, I can unmute yourself. Just let me control the mouse for a second. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great.
You have
Sorry
the
about
controls now. Again, okay, no problem.
And thank you for including me in this. And I'm learning a lot. So I think this is an excellent webinar for me. We were part of a coalition that included labor, environmentalists, environmental justice groups, and industry groups that worked in 2017 to pass a piece of legislation in California called the Buy Clean California Act. The governor at the time, Jerry Brown, had already done an executive order a couple of years earlier encouraging state agencies to reduce their embodied carbon, but we hadn't seen much action. And so decided together that there would be, that we should pull together some kind of legislative approach. Over a period of about 6 to 7 months, we worked with industry and the labor folks and some of the folks who initially were opposed to the bill but ultimately dropped their opposition to figure out a way we could do this Buy Clean California Act to reduce emissions in construction materials that are used in state projects. The state in California, the state spends on average $10 billion a year on construction. So it's a big market. It seemed a really good opportunity to use market forces to encourage manufacturers to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. and at the same time as we encourage greater reporting of greenhouse gas emissions and got agencies to start thinking about how they spend their money and to spend it in a way that's consistent with the state's values, which include reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The Act applies to state agencies. It's implemented by the Department of General Services. It ultimately will require that contractors who win bids have to present environmental product declarations for certain specified products. In the legislation, we specified 4 products, but those products are not the only products that will ever be covered by this. Other products can be added later. And the specified products must meet a global warming potential standard that's going to be set by DGS based on what it appears for each of those products, what appears to be sort of the median. And what we're hoping to get is that we'll be buying from the least polluting, not the most polluting manufacturers. So the one thing that has changed about the Buy Clean Act since it was first introduced is that there was a decision to extend some of the timelines. Frankly, the bill got through much faster than we anticipated. So extending the timelines was fine with the author of the bill, Rob Bonta, an assembly member. So currently what's going on is awarding authorities are, meaning state agencies, are requesting EPDs for the project materials from contractors. So this year is an option. Contractors are being encouraged to submit EPDs, and these are contractors, again, who have already won awards to or won contracts with the state. And then beginning in January, those contractors will be required to submit EPDs for these specific materials. In 2021, given the information that they have already accumulated from those EPDs that came from the project materials and also from other research, the Department of General Service will have to establish a global warming potential limit. That's sort of what's the median there. And then finally, in July of 2021, awarding authorities will be required, that means state agencies will be requiring EPDs that are at or below that global warming potential, or that global warming limit, potential limit. Right now, the biggest challenge that the Department of General Services has is making sure that the correct information is out there and that contractors are aware of the requirement that will be coming up in 2020, but that the requirement now is a voluntary requirement, that they provide EPDs for certain materials. Those certain materials that were included in the original bill include carbon steel, rebar, structural steel, flat glass windows, flat glass, and steel or mineral wool fiberboard. That's a kind of insulation. And here are some resources where you can go to the DGS website, the Buy Clean website, U.S. Green Building Council in Los Angeles has a Buy Clean incentive program. Much of the work on this bill and on the coming up with the concept and then the implementation work, sort of the bird dogging of the work, has been funded by the ClimateWorks Foundation. And ClimateWorks Foundation, among other things, provided some funding to U.S. Green Building Council Los Angeles to help provide incentives for those manufacturers who are doing business in California and have not yet gotten facility-specific environmental product declarations done. And then there's a link to our Sierra Club California Buy Clean page. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Catherine. And now we will have Jordan Palmieri to share. Jordan Palmieri is a senior policy analyst in the materials management program at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, where he coordinates projects around the built environment, life cycle assessments, and purchasing. Jordan's been with Oregon Department of Environmental Quality for 14 years. His early work focused on environmental site cleanup, improving water quality, and reducing toxics in water bodies. He then shifted to reducing the life cycle impacts materials and products with a particular focus on building materials. He's worked on building and zoning codes and served as a technical and policy expert for small housing initiatives. He's advised local, regional, and global green building rating systems and leads a program to help Oregon concrete producers develop environmental product declarations. Jordan holds a master's in environmental science from Tulane University. Jordan? Hello, Jordan. Can you hear us? I think you're muted.
Hi there, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, all right. So thanks for the introduction, Victoria. And I'm fortunate to work with many cities across the state of Oregon on various initiatives. And it's been a particular pleasure to work with the city of Portland on the first few policies that I'll be presenting on today. I do want to note that Portland's currently developing a sustainable consumption strategy, which will have a section that addresses the embodied carbon emissions of the built environment. I'm participating in the work group to develop this strategy, and we plan to have a draft strategy out by the end of 2019. I'm mentioning this because I think the final strategy will be a useful resource for other cities, along with some of the other great resources that we learned about from the other presenters today that are coming out over the next 6 months or so. So let's see, just getting the slides working here. Okay, so here are the policies I'm going to be covering today. Oregon DEQ has played a collaborative role in the development of the City of Portland policies that I'll be discussing today, and then I'll talk about one State of Oregon policy at the end. Let's start by discussing Portland Residential Deconstruction Ordinance, which requires deconstruction of certain detached homes and duplexes throughout the city. In July 2016, Portland passed an ordinance to require deconstruction, and the policy went into effect just 4 months later in October of 2016. Now, this policy didn't just pop up out of the blue. You know, the city had been working on building capacity towards it for years. In 2015, City Council provided direction that they wanted to see this happen. They then integrated this action into their climate action plan at the city level and started giving grants to help incentivize projects. Along the way, the city and other partners like Oregon DEQ supported workforce development to help ensure that the policy would actually be effective when implemented. Now, the ordinance itself says that deconstruction is required if the structure is a detached home or duplex built in 1916 or earlier, or is a designated historic resource. The threshold of 1916 or earlier was chosen because it represents about 1/3 of all house demolitions in Portland in the years leading up to the ordinance. This was a significant portion of overall house and duplex demolitions. However, it was right-sized in terms of what the industry could successfully take on. Too little, and we're not really advancing the industry. Too much, and we overwhelm the industry. So let's talk about the outcomes of this policy. Ensuring we had enough companies trained and certified workers to do the work was really critical for the launch. So there were a bunch of different trainings offered and to get people ready to enter the workforce. And the workforce trainings prioritized participation by women, people of color, and other disadvantaged groups. Once homes were being deconstructed, a lot of wood hit the local market. And in some cases, there was really more supply than there was demand for the wood. So, because of this dynamic, Portland started looking at other outlets for the salvaged lumber. And one of those outlets was cross-laminated timber panels. Oregon State University right now is conducting research on the potential to use salvaged lumber in CLT panels. Using a variety of lumber from different projects in the Portland area, they're now conducting strength testing and grading on the 2x4s and also assembling a CLT panel for testing as well. The other piece of research I wanted to highlight is a carbon and energy evaluation that we at Oregon DEQ conducted for the city. The main goal of this study was to understand the carbon benefits of the city's deconstruction policy. In this study, we looked at the first 36 homes that passed through the deconstruction program and took a really detailed inventory of all the materials they salvaged and hauled off-site in a drop box. We quantified the impacts of each deconstruction project, and then we modeled the project as if it were then being mechanically demolished, with all the materials being hauled off-site in just a drop box with nothing being salvaged. And then we basically compared the two scenarios to understand the impacts of deconstruction versus mechanical demolition. Results show that we saw that the average home deconstructed in Portland yields about 10,000 pounds of material, which is approximately 27% of the total house weight, which does exclude the foundation. And we can see here in this chart that the average home salvage material was really dominated by softwood lumber. That's all the material. That's what we were looking at. A little bit of plywood, showed a blip on the screen there as well. And here's the average carbon benefit of deconstructing a home in Portland versus mechanically demolishing it. And we found that on average, deconstruction of residential homes in Portland had double the carbon benefits of a mechanical demolition. Now, the net benefit between these scenarios equates to roughly 1.6 cars taken off the road for 1 year for each home being deconstructed. When we break the carbon impacts down by activity, we found that the materials really dominated the impacts. Material transport, worker transport, and equipment use were really inconsequential. So it's really all about the materials here. It's really about the embodied carbon in those materials. Finally, when we look at the policy as a whole, there's been approximately 250 homes deconstructed since the policy took effect in 2016. And based on this research, the net carbon benefit of the policy is roughly equivalent to offsetting the new construction embodied impact of roughly a 50,000 square foot commercial building. So at the end of the day, the analysis shows that deconstruction does have clear environmental benefits. And we hope this is useful to others considering a deconstruction policy, because we're certainly going to use this information to promote deconstruction in other cities around Oregon. The next policy I'm going to be discussing is the City of Portland's concrete EPD purchasing policy. Just about 3 weeks ago, the City of Portland passed the first policy in North America to require EPDs for all city purchases of concrete. They will also require EPDs, they will require the EPDs starting in January 1st, 2020, and then establish a global warming potential by April 1st, 2021. And they'll set this threshold by collecting EPDs on projects for about a year, and then using a variety of information sources to set a threshold that really strives for carbon reductions on city projects. And then by January 1, 2022, all EPDs, all concrete EPDs submitted to city projects will need to have a global warming potential below whatever that threshold is set at. And so at this point, you can probably tell that this policy is essentially like a Buy Clean California policy, but it's local to Portland and exclusively focused on concrete. And so we're really excited to continue working with Portland to help make this policy successful. You might be wondering why Portland is focusing on concrete versus all the other materials we heard about, for instance, during Catherine's presentation on Buy Clean California. Now, Portland first started to identify priorities for carbon reductions by conducting greenhouse gas inventory of city operations. And you heard Truda talk about this in her presentation about how valuable doing Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions inventories are. And here it is. This is their Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions inventories. And, we could see that the Scope 3 emissions, which, are those emissions all the way on the right associated with the city purchasing activities, really dominated their greenhouse gas inventory. It wasn't the operation of their buildings or the cars that they drove around, but instead it was the materials and services that they purchased that dominated their impacts as a city. Now, before I move on, I do want to point out that this situation is not really unique. Most public institutions, when you look at all scopes of their greenhouse gas inventories, supply chain emissions typically end up dominating from their purchasing activities. If you want more information about this or other studies that show this, feel free to contact me afterwards. So once Portland figured out that their spending was the real target, they decided to look deeper into their spending and conducted a supply chain analysis. Now, results of the supply chain analysis showed that construction services dominated their supply chain emissions. And when you look deeper into those emissions, you find that concrete is a major source of emissions to that category. Again, here, I want to point out that this isn't particularly unique, and a lot of cities will likely find something similar when they do their own emissions inventories. So after the supply chain analysis, Portland then developed a sustainable procurement policy, where they specifically identified the use of EPDs as a purchasing tool. At the same time, the same sustainable purchasing policy was passed, the program that I run, Oregon DEQ's voluntary concrete EPD program, was really starting to show some results. By early 2019, we had about 1,500 EPDs published from 7 different plants across the Portland metro area. So as you can see, there's kind of quite a few pieces of the puzzle that had fallen into place that gave Portland the ability to pass this precedent-setting policy for concrete. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention a critical piece of passing this policy was the direct support from Oregon concrete producers. We've established a real positive working relationship with them, and it resulted in the local producers providing support and very constructive feedback on the policy itself. All right, so I'm going to quickly highlight a City of Portland zoning policy that I think is worth mentioning. Under the city's residential infill policy, which is being developed right now, there's a dramatic shift away from single dwelling housing units for Portland. And one aspect of this policy is a limit on house size. And that has a direct and immediate effect on embodied carbon. In exchange for a house size limit, the city's proposing that more flexibility be given within that limit to build duplexes and triplexes in zones that would traditionally only allow a single unit. I mention this policy because I think it's important for us to look at other policies that conserve material resources and talk about them as embodied carbon policies. The more we socialize the term, the more momentum we'll gain in passing policies that reduce embodied carbon. Last but not least is an upcoming policy for the state of Oregon. A 2017 executive order requires that newly constructed state buildings consider reduction strategies for reducing embodied carbon. And so we're just starting to discuss our approach to this policy, and I'm excited to start working on state buildings. And then finally, last but not least, if this is the type of work that interests you, we're hiring soon. We're putting out a job in the summertime where at least 50% of the job will focus on built environment activities. So if that's something you're interested in, please contact me to get on our outreach list. And so thank you so much for your time and attention, and that's all I've got today.
Great. Thank you very much, Jordan. And now, not to put pressure on you, Ryan, but we have a very short amount of time here. So I want to introduce you all to Ryan Ciso. He is founder and chief operating officer of Mantle, and a strategic consultancy focused on climate change, resiliency, and the move toward the low carbon economy. As a professional engineer and green building expert, Ryan Ciso creates and implements sustainability strategies that help clients understand track, and reduce their environmental impacts and exposure to climate risk. Strategies including green building certifications, embodied carbon life cycle assessment, and resiliency strategies. He has worked on over 50 green building and neighborhood projects with leading Canadian and European architects, developers, and property management firms, and spent 3 years working in the leading Nordic green building scene in Helsinki, Finland. Ryan is also the chair of the Embodied Carbon Networks Policy Focus Group. Ryan?
Great, thank you. And you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you for those fantastic presentations. I think they well exceeded my expectations. Just trying to click through the slides. Doesn't seem to be going yet. Okay, there we go. So I will be quick. I just wanted to give everyone a quick update on building rating systems and how they're addressing embodied carbon and updates to those. So I'm going to touch on 2 rating systems. The first is LEED, and the second is the Canada Green Building Council's Zero Carbon Building Standard. So as most of you probably know, LEED v4 is the most recent full version of LEED that was launched in 2013. And it is actually the first version of LEED that includes a strategy for whole building lifecycle assessment. So that was a really big deal. It can be found under the Building Lifecycle Impact Reduction Materials credit under option 4. There's a whole building lifecycle assessment option for three points available. And quickly, the point works by saying if you're able to reduce your design showing a 10% reduction in embodied carbon plus a 10% reduction in 2 other life cycle indicators, and none of them go up by more than 5%, then you get 3 points. There's also an additional 4th point available if you can reduce all 6 indicators by 10%. And in some areas, you can get an additional point up to a 5th point for a regional priority. I know that's the case in Canada. I'm not sure about the US, but I think that's the same in the US as well. So LEED v4 was great to introduce this, but there was a bit of a feeling that it was kind of an all or a nothing credit. You kind of got the 3 points if you could demonstrate that baseline reduction by 10%, or you didn't get any. There was no option to have a 1 point or 2 points. And these questions on the slide here would come up a lot if you would ask a building designer or owner to go for this credit. And this was the first time this credit was available. So, you know, these are not uncommon questions that they'd be asking. How much is this going to cost us? Will we have to change the design to meet the credit requirements? And, you know, how much of the design are we going to have to change? How much is that going to cost? None of those answers were really available until you would do the analysis. So you were kind of committed to kind of spending a bit of not insignificant amount of money to do an LCA analysis on the project without having any clear idea of what the results would be and if you were able to get the credit. So it was a bit of a barrier to entry for the way that the credit was originally designed. So luckily, in December of 2018, there was a version 4.1 beta released of LEED, and it provides significantly more flexibility and a lot lower barrier to entry for this credit. So you can see in this table, I just show the different point thresholds, whereas in LEED v4, as I said, the starting point was 3 points for proving the 10% reduction, whereas in LEED v4.1, you can now get up 1 point to the first point just for performing the LCA that is compliant with the requirements of LEED, no matter what the results show. So even if you do an LCA and show that actually we're not doing that great on an embodied carbon front, you're at least still awarded 1 point for investigating that and looking at the LCA. You can get a second point for a 5% reduction in embodied carbon plus 2 other categories. You can get a third point for 10%, and then an additional point up to 4 if you can show a 20% reduction in embodied carbon plus 10% reduction in 2 other categories, and incorporating some elements of building reuse or resalvage materials in the structure or enclosure. So as you can see, that new layout or the new point thresholds is a much lower barrier to entry. It allows a designer or a lead consultant or a sustainability consultant to say to their client, let's try out this new thing called life cycle assessment that we haven't done before. No matter what the results show us, we can guarantee that we'll get at least 1 point. And who knows, we might even find that there's some really low cost ways that we can actually achieve a couple more points if we change a few tweaks here or there to the design. That's a much easier discussion to have with the client than the discussion that we previously had under version 4. So this is kind of how I like to think of version 4 versus version 4.1 in terms of their response to embodied carbon in life cycle assessment. They're both doable and winnable, but version 4.1 I like to think of as a much safer space. So that's the update on LEED. Quickly to touch on the Zero Carbon Building Standard, which was launched by the Canada Green Building Council in May of 2017 as a pilot. The pilot required all projects as a prerequisite, which is different from LEED because, as you know, LEED, the LCA point, is just one option of many that people can perform. So many LEED projects wouldn't even have looked at LCA. But in the Zero Carbon Building Standard, it was a requirement. You had to calculate and report your embodied carbon. There was no requirement in terms of performance levels. So you didn't have to be below a certain threshold, for example, but you at least had to calculate it. And that was a great first step to push the Canadian market. The pilot actually just finished, and the CAGBC is now developing the next full version of the standard. I'm actually on the steering committee of the standard, so help to guide the approach to embodied carbon going forward. And I can let you know what is currently being proposed. It's pending final approval, but we are now proposing to include embodied carbon in the zero carbon balance that is required for the building. So it's no longer okay to kind of zero out your operational energy, which is what we were doing before, and then just report your embodied carbon. You have to actually have the embodied carbon be part of your zero carbon balance now, which is obviously a big improvement. And then the other important aspect that we changed was we're saying only new materials need to be included in the life cycle assessment and the embodied carbon calculation. And we're using this as a way to prioritize retrofits and reuse. So any materials that aren't new, that are being retrofitted or reused, they obviously are excluded from that zero carbon balance. So as I said, those are still pending final approval, but that's the direction that the standard is going in. And we think it's a big change. And that's it. So wanted to hand it back over to Victoria.
Thank you, Ryan. And for those that have not sent any questions and you might have any, please use the Zoom group chat to send any questions to this. We have some already here. There is one for Truda. How have the leading countries balancing between prescriptive requirements and performance-based requirements?
Thank you for that. I don't think I have a very specific answer to this, but I can refer to what some of our cities have been talking about. So it's not necessarily, we don't work all that much with countries. I know that from my own country, Norway, the state-owned construction company has a new national standard on embodied carbon. But what I can say is that I think most of the cities that we talk to move on to prescriptive requirements first, so addressing materials used in the buildings. But once they start doing more LCA work for the building, they incorporate, of course, where the building is located, so transport emissions connected to the building, and how much emissions do you get from actually having to dig into the ground? Do you need to have a parking garage in the basement in a city where the goal is to actually have hardly any cars at all? So those questions come up, and then we're no longer only talking about prescriptive measures, but then of course the more performance of the whole building through the life cycle of the building. I don't know if that was a good enough answer, but I think that's what I'm going to limit myself to at this point.
Thank you, Truda. We have also question for Jordan. Did you find the quantity of salvage wood sufficient for investigating CLT manufacturing potentials? They have done similar efforts in Vancouver with small quantities of salvage wood relative to new lumber used for manufacturing was a challenge.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that question. So let's see. Yes, there's a substantial amount of new wood production in Oregon and not a lot of salvage lumber. But nevertheless, there's still, excess salvage lumber that, isn't being reutilized in the Portland market. And if other cities adopt, deconstruction ordinances, I feel like people are constantly exploring where to find new markets for wood. So I feel like the small amount was not necessarily a challenge yet. We just still have to get through the testing phase to see if we could get it in the panel and have it be structurally sound. And then as far as do we have enough supply to warrant the actual manufacturing of CLT, I don't really know the answer to that. I think we got to get through the testing phase first, but it sounds like maybe we want to talk to you up in Vancouver, whoever listed this comment, to understand what some of your supply and demand challenges are. So we're not quite there yet, but looking to learn a lot more soon.
Thank you, Jordan. There is also one of the attendees is asking Catherine for the AB 262 implementation website. Is it active? Because I'm not sure if there is an URL available, or maybe the one you were. I'm not sure if you were sharing one on the slides.
Yeah, there is. If you go to dgs.ca.gov, you can do a search there. But on the last slide, under Department of General Services, there is an AB 32 implementation link. But will all the participants have access to the slides? Because if so, they'll be able to go right to that link.
Thank you, Catherine. I have a question for Patrick. I'm curious about if there has been any studies completed about wood availability if high-rise, suddenly everybody decides to go with high-rise using wood versus concrete, how that will be.
Yes, so that's a great question. That's something I've looked into. I don't have any specific, I don't have the specific stats on hand, but I've been told that even just based on BC's pretty prolific production of timber and current exports in terms of, even just in terms of raw logs, that there's plenty of spare capacity within the BC's production of timber. And even looking beyond BC. So yeah, even if everything was built out of new construction was built out of mass timber, there's lots of wood ready to go.
Great, thank you. Yes.
And hey, this is Jordan, and on the mass timber question again, I think I maybe understand the question a little better now about incorporating salvage lumber. The test that we're doing at Oregon State University is integrating salvaged lumber into a panel that has a mix of salvaged and new lumber. So it's not trying to make a CLT panel made exclusively out of salvaged lumber. It's a mix of salvage with new lumber. So just wanted to clarify that.
Great, thank you very much. And I think we're running out of time. There's one last minute for any other questions. Anybody has?
Sorry, Victoria, this is Ryan. I just wanted to confirm the slides will be made available to everyone. That's true, right?
Yes, we will create a PDF, and the webinar also will be available, the recording, on the website.
Fantastic.
I just wanted to add one thing to my answer there about the wood availability. Even if there wasn't excess wood being exported, you'd see what I think we'd see is a shift from shorter-lived wood products or wood fiber products to longer-lived wood fiber products, and that's understanding the carbon impacts of that would be good to kind of better understand as well. But that's part of the equation there too.
Great, thank you. So thank you, Truda, Patrick, Catherine, Jordan, and Ryan very much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and insight. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining. And if you have any questions or comments, please send them to info@embodiedcarbonnetwork.org. If you have not joined the Embodied Carbon Network yet, sign up today at embodiedcarbonnetwork.org, and you all have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.